Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. On May 17, 1968, a group of 9 Catholic peace activists led by Fathers Philip and Daniel Berrigan entered a Selective Service office in Catonsville, Maryland, seized hundreds of draft cards, and burned them with homemade napalm while reciting the Lord's Prayer as a protest against the war in Vietnam. They were arrested, tried, and sentenced to prison, while their action inspired anti-war activists around the country. Daniel Berrigan wrote a play about the events called The Trial of the Catonsville Nine, which is being revived by the Transport Group in collaboration with the National Asian American Theater Company. It's on stage in Lower Manhattan at the Abrams Art Center on Grand Street until February 23rd, and I'm very pleased that it has brought its director, Jack Cummings III, along with Daniel Berrigan's close friend, editor and literary executive John Deere, to our show. Welcome.
Thank you.
And John?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good to have you.
Thank you.
Jack, why revive the show now, over 50 years after the events?
Well, I mean, primarily because the human issues, the political issues, and the fights that they were waging are just as relevant now as they were then, despite the fact that the Vietnam War is over. But
you see other kinds of parallels?
Yes. Many of the characters, the people they're based on, talk very deeply about the rights of the president, about a president breaking a law, about cops' brutality towards African Americans, discrimination against people from Latin America. So, astonishingly, most of it is incredibly still relevant.
And that was from the transcript of the trial?
Yes, it's from actually what happened. The transcript of the trial, I believe, and John, just feel free to correct me on any of this since you are always going to know more than I do. From what I've researched, Daniel Berrigan basically received the 1,200-page transcripts from the trial and turned it into a play.
Didn't you grow up in Catonsville?
I sort of. I was born in Catonsville. My mother's side of the family is very Catonsville since the late 19th century. And I was just a couple blocks away in a crib when on May 17th. And then we moved away in August of 1969. I was about a year and a half old.
So you don't have any real memories of this?
No.
John, weren't you too young to have participated in the events in Catonsville?
Oh, yeah. I was probably 9 years old, but later became a priest and was part of Dan's community for almost 40 years and a real close friend of his. So, yeah, I'm the next generation, I guess, with Jack.
So that's when you met Daniel Berrigan, when you became a priest?
I met Dan in the early 80s and lived with him for many years in New York, traveled the country and the world with him, and edited 5 of his books, and, was just really involved with him, maybe his closest friend. And he died, as you know, in April 2016, and now I'm his literary executor.
And we should point out that he not only wrote this play, he wrote poetry and he wrote other books as well. He was a prolific writer. He probably would have been made a living as a writer if he hadn't become a priest.
Well, yeah, and he was a great writer. He wrote over 50 books, and his first book of poetry won the Lopate Poetry Award in the late 50s. So he was a celebrity as a poet, and this is unusual for a priest. And so he's compared to the famous priest writer Thomas Merton, and they were best friends. But Dan, I think, was a great poet, way better than Merton, and that's what a lot of people thought. But when the war started, he became a full-time activist and his poetry changed. And when they did Catonsville, it was very, very, very hard to get into that. These were the first priests ever arrested in the United States against war or injustice. It never happened before, and they were then on the cover of Time magazine. So it was really shocking at a number of levels.
And
This literary figure, a priest, and then this real leader in resistance. But he went on to write many books and be nominated for the Nobel Prize and nominated for the National Book Award many times and so forth.
he and his brother were nominated for a Nobel. He died at the age of 94. Had he named you his literary executor?
Yeah, we had set that up many years before to try to keep his writings and message alive and
Now-
his work of peace.
Now,
That's what I'm trying to do.
like Daniel, you were a Jesuit, but didn't you leave the order a few years ago?
Yeah, I left the order a few years ago and became a diocesan priest. I'm still a Catholic priest, but I'm based in California. I was a Jesuit for 32 years, and just before Dan died, switched because, as you well know, the church has changed so much in the United States and moved so far to the right, and I'm a full-time peace activist, too. Been arrested about 85 times, spent a year in prison, and the order just told me I could never work for peace again. And Dan died really sad by the way the church has changed. And Pope Francis is, we're now working with Pope Francis on peace and nonviolence, and he's very progressive on social issues, so that's a hopeful sign. But I'm still a priest and still at it and still keeping Dan's cause alive, and the times are worse than ever, and yet that's why I'm so happy Jack is doing the play, because the point is we all have to keep working. We should be talking about abolishing war and nuclear weapons and the whole culture of violence and working for a new culture of nonviolence, and that's what they were trying to do at Catonsville.
But weren't the Jesuits actually many of the most progressive priests Jesuits at the time?
Yeah, and they probably still are, but I mean, Dan and I are the farthest left in the United States. And Dan was so famous. I mean, he was in the front page of the New York Times almost every day for a year and on the cover of Time. And it's so everybody presumes that the Jesuit order is Daniel Berrigan from the late 60s and the early 70s. But that's not the case. And certainly now, 50 years later, the church has really changed. Most of the bishops are Republicans. They're advocating for Trump. I mean, and they weren't doing that under Nixon. You see that how much has changed, and that I would get in so much. I've been in much more trouble than Dan was.
There are a couple of
Dan broke so much new ground, huh?
A couple of other Jesuits on the left, Robert Drinan, most recently James Martin.
Yeah, and he's doing good work on behalf of gays and lesbians. And Father Steve Kelly is in prison right now for entering the Trident submarine base in Georgia last year. In prison with him is Elizabeth McAllister, who's now 80 years old, Philip Berrigan's wife. Did you know that, Leonard?
I didn't, but I do know that Philip Berrigan, he obviously left the church, but he had a daughter.
No, he didn't.
Oh.
He didn't leave the church. He had 3 kids, his wife Liz. They're all still active. Phil died in 2002, Dan in 2016. Liz, his wife, is a former nun, is in prison still for protesting. They have 3 kids. They're all full-time activists. They're all great and carrying on the Berrigan legacy. And in fact, they're quite astonishing people, all of them.
What led to...
But that Liz at 80 years old is still in prison for a protest action is just amazing to me. Amazing.
For the protest, not Catonsville, a different protest action?
Right. This was last year at the Trident submarine base in St. Mary's, Georgia. There were 7 people walked onto the base into the security zone with banners and signs and were arrested and faced 5 years in prison.
Jack, it sounds like there's another play
Possibly.
possible somewhere down the line. What led to the events in Catonsville in 1968? Was the Vietnam War the turning point for the Berrigans?
I think so. I mean,
Jack, you want me to speak? Yeah, go ahead. Jack.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, the both of you can speak.
Yeah, I think many things were leading up to that. I don't think it was I think the Vietnam War was probably the tipping point, but I think that their passion for just causes and for social injustice was at an all-time high, and the war just kicked it into the highest level possible.
Did they feel?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
They were very close with Dorothy Day. They were both involved in the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Dan marched in Selma. The Berrigans, as priests, tried to be on the freedom rides and were told they would be kicked out of their orders if they did it, so they didn't. And then Dan's student was the first person to burn a draft card in 1965, so they were very involved. And Phil, as 65 and 66 and 67 were going on, and people were starting to march and speak out, was adamant that that was not enough. And so in 1967, Phil and three others walked into a draft board place in Baltimore, not in Catonsville, this was before Catonsville, and poured blood on files and were arrested and jailed. The week before, Dan took part on the biggest mobilization yet in the war, October 67, when 50,000 students marched on the Pentagon, and they were arrested and held in jail for 2 weeks. Dan technically is the first priest ever arrested in the U.S. But Phil gets out on bond in the early 1968. Dan has gone to Vietnam with Howard Zinn. Dr. King is assassinated, and Phil says, we got to do another action, and we got to get more people involved. And they start planning Catonsville, and so Phil recruits Dan to join it, and the group becomes the Catonsville Nine. But Phil was really the brains of the operation and was a die-hard organizer and activist and resistor. And his point was, they're going to let us march till we're blue in the face. We need to take the lead, not the government, and actually throw a wrench into the system and destroy their records. And remember, there's no computers. They only had one typed page of every person going off to Vietnam. When they burned those files, those guys never went to Vietnam. And what people don't realize, Dan and Phil were so famous, but that inspired 300, some say 325 other draft file actions up into 1972. So like by 1971, some actions in Boston, Rhode Island, Syracuse, they burned thousands of files and shut down the draft. They couldn't have any more draft in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, D.C., and they were systematically going state by state. And that's why the government was putting big sentences against them. But you could argue they knew the war was ending because they couldn't draft men. The records were all gone. That story has never really been told.
Now you said
and it was all inspired by Catonsville.
You said that in 1968, Daniel went to Hanoi with Howard Zinn. What was the purpose of that trip?
Well, what happened, and Howard was not famous then, but was very involved in the movement. Dan was the famous celebrity poet. And Tom Hayden got a telegram from Hanoi saying, we will release 3 U.S. prisoners of war to 2 leaders of the U.S. peace movement, but they have to get on the plane within 24 hours. We want to do this like Friday. And Tom Hayden called Howard Zinn, who was the professor in Atlanta, and called Daniel Berrigan, who was at Cornell at the time, and they both dropped everything, went to New York, got on the plane, and flew around the world to Hanoi. And so they were meeting with the Viet Cong for a week. You can imagine what it was like. Dan published his journal about it, and they were going to be releasing these 3 prisoners of war. They were there a day, and the U.S., we think, deliberately bombed the area where Dan and Howard were staying for a week, as high a bombing as there ever was.
Who was the president at the time?
And they were in the shelters the whole...
Johnson.
Was that still LBJ?
Johnson was president. This was January 1968. 3 years later, when Joan Baez went over, they did the same thing. They bombed the exact spot where she was and she didn't get to have the meetings with the Viet Cong. And then when Dan and Howard, when the bombing ended, they were given the 3 prisoners. They took them out. The plane landed in Hanoi, and the U.S. military charged the plane and took the prisoners and canceled the press conference. And kind of, you can imagine. But that changed Howard and Dan both after they experienced a week of bombing to up their ante with their lives. And so Dan did the Catonsville 9. And when 1970, after the trial, and they were found guilty and they had to turn themselves in, they didn't turn themselves in. And Dan went underground for 8 months. And what people often don't know is that Howard Zinn organized Dan's underground period, where the FBI couldn't find Daniel Berrigan. He's appearing on the CBS News, preaching in churches, writing in the Village Voice, and giving interviews in the New York Times once a week. And J. Edgar Hoover was desperate to catch Dan Berrigan, and it took him a while.
I'm speaking about the events that led to the trial of the Catonsville 9, which is being revived as a play. We're speaking with John Deere, who is Daniel Berrigan's editor and literary executor, and Jack Cummings III, who is the director of these performances. So, Daniel decided to join in when Philip organized this larger protest in Catonsville. Who were the other 7 protesters?
There were George Mishi, Thomas and Marjorie Melville, who were an ex-priest and nun of the Maryknoll Order. They had just been married right before Catonsville. A young man, a brother named David Darst, an ex-brother named John Hogan, a painter and artist named Thomas Lewis, and a nurse and midwife named Mary Moylan.
Okay, so David Darst was a Christian brother. What does that mean?
John, you can answer that better than I can.
So it's a small Catholic religious order. Dan was a Jesuit, as I was the biggest order in the world. And there's the Franciscans and the Dominicans. This was a small religious order. And nobody knew David Darst. He lived in St. Louis. And after Phil did that first action, which got a lot of national press, he wrote a letter. Darst was like 21 or 22 years old, this young seminarian. And he said, if you do this again, I want to come. And, 2 days before Catonsville, Phil met him at the airport in Baltimore, not knowing what to expect. But he was a kind of conservative young Catholic seminary who hated the war. And what's so incredible and tragic is about 6 months after the trial, he was killed. He was in a bad car crash in Missouri, and the car exploded, and he and his friend died. So, he died when he was about 23 years old.
George Mish.
That's David Darst.
George Mish had worked in Latin America with the Alliance for Progress. And hadn't a number of priests throughout Latin America practiced what was called liberation theology, which was opposed at the time by the Vatican? Was that an influence?
It was all building up. They didn't call it liberation theology till the mid-'70s, but Latin America was exploding, and the fascism and dictatorships were full on, and because of Vatican II and Dr. King, the reformation of the Catholic Church toward more justice and peace in the 60s, there were thousands of missionary priests and nuns from the U.S. and Ireland all over Latin America, like the Melvilles, who were really radicalized. And at the beginning of the revolutionary movements and leaders, like the Melvilles were in Guatemala and seeing how the U.S. had overthrown people, were backing the death squads, long before anybody else knew that by the 80s. A lot of us knew that then. So they were the Melvilles and George Mish were really cutting-edge people, and in fact were kicked out of Guatemala for accusations of being with the resistance there. And so they came to the Catonsville action saying it's not just Vietnam War, it's Guatemala and Peru and Africa and India. And so that's why the play is so powerful, because were allowed to tell their stories. And they're amazing, amazing people.
Thomas Melville was a former Maryknoll priest. His wife, Marjorie Bradford Melville, was a former nun. and as you said, they had worked in Guatemala. Did they leave their orders because of their political activities?
I thought they left because they wanted to get
yeah,
married.
Because they wanted to get married.
Yeah, I thought.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't stop Philip Berrigan.
Well, I mean, he had to leave. John, you have to stop being a priest if you get married, correct?
Right.
I mean, so he didn't leave the church as a goer, but he left the church as a priest.
And then John...
Yeah, he didn't, no, Phil never left the church. He left the priesthood.
Right.
You see what I mean? And the same with the Melvilles, too.
Right.
We're all still Catholic, and that was another interesting angle about Catonsville. Why were Catholics taking these high-risk actions, which were way beyond Dr. King's level of civil disobedience, where you're going to get years in prison, and compared to the Weathermen, who are doing violence and maybe blowing up buildings and killing people and getting years in prison, the Berrigans were leading actions that were nonviolent. Nobody was to get hurt, and that was the hallmark of it. So they were learning from Dr. King, but they were trying to up the ante of Dr. King. Oh, that's very interesting to me.
The three others were John Hogan, who also worked in Guatemala as part of the Mary Knoll Project, and Mary Moylan, who was a nurse who had served in Africa with the Women Volunteers Association, a Catholic service organization. Had her work in Africa led her to take up political action?
Yeah, I mean, she says in the play in her testimony, she was there in '65 when there was bombing in the Congo, and it was reported that the planes bombing the Congo were American planes. And
do we know that they actually were?
I believe so. Yeah, I think time has proven that to be. Basically, everything that they all claim in the play, whether it's the Melvilles claiming that the U.S. executed alleged and real Guatemalan communists, or that the planes in Uganda bombing the Congo were American, every single thing, as far as my research shows, has been proven absolutely 100% true.
And then there was Tom, one other was Tom Lewis, who was an artist and a teacher. He had been involved in the Baltimore action with Philip Berrigan as well.
Yes. What makes Philip and
so he
Tom,
was out on bail along with Philip?
Yeah. I mean, and this comes up in the play, but what makes the two of them, remarkable in other ways is that they went to Catonsville knowing full well after what had happened in Baltimore that they were going to be facing additional jail time. I mean, the sentence for Baltimore was 6 years. So they went to Catonsville bravely already facing 6 years potentially in prison. And so that's also kind of astounding to all of us who've worked on the play, was that they did this knowing full well it would just be made worse for them.
Why did they choose Catonsville for this action? There were draft boards all over the country.
I think, John, Philip was with the Society of St. Joseph in Baltimore, and they so he was local, as were a few of the others. But from what I have read, one of the reasons that they chose the actual Knights of Columbus building, which the Selective Service had rented a room in to be their office.
Knights of Columbus being a Catholic organization.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Catonsville is as Catholic can get, and so it's a white house on Frederick Road. It's benign and pretty and unguarded, and they'd cased it. And so they knew that it was going to be easy to break into.
So Phil was the leader of the movement in Baltimore and D.C. He was so outspoken, and he's still a priest. And he's going to D.C. regularly. Like with a year before, he led a march and a vigil at McNamara's house, if you can imagine. And McNamara came out and talked to Phil. And he was in the papers and all, but he was the real leader. And Tom lived in Baltimore also, and the others were all mainly D.C. people. And they all knew Phil and Tom. And there were a lot of other friends, by the way, who almost did the action. A lot of people who later became well-known, Liz being one of them. But, wow, when they found out that there's a little nice building in Catonsville that the Catholic Church owns and is doing Catholic stuff, and they've rented it out to run the Vietnam War, all the young men in the Baltimore area who were going to go off and kill in Vietnam are based out of that Catholic building. It was like, this is definitely the place that we're going to go. And they didn't know what was going to happen. they hoped and planned, but it was like that Knights of the Columbus Hall angle on it was very much a part of why they picked that place.
What did their superiors in the church think about all their activities? Were they getting into trouble for this?
Terrible trouble. How Dan ever stayed in, I don't understand. Well, he was so famous. At one point, they were always threatening him. He was told he was not allowed to go to Vietnam, or he would be kicked out of the order. That was him and Thomas Merton were talking about that in January 67. When he went in January 68, he didn't ask permission. He just went. So they were mad at him for that. And then he's in prison, and Catonsville was the headlines around the world when that action happened. And it's mystifying to me how it's not reported in shows about the 60s. Like, it was never even mentioned in Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam, for example.
Despite the fact that a number of really famous people were involved. William Kunstler served as their defense attorney.
Yeah, it's all, and it really inspired the movement. To me, they were the heart of the whole anti-Vietnam War movement. But
I just want to add really.
Furious were furious. Well, at one point, the move in Rome was to have Dan dismissed, probably around 1969. And some leaders immediately got on the plane and flew to Rome and said, none of us like Dan, even though he's actually a really nice guy, but he's yelling all over the country that if you're not against this war, you're killing Jesus in Vietnam. No one had ever said things like that before. And so, but the message to Rome was, if you get rid of Dan, thousands and thousands of young Jesuits will immediately leave the order, and probably a lot of thousands of nuns and other seminarians. He was bigger than Dr. King within the Catholic Church. This mythic, he became such a folk hero, and that's why they really couldn't get rid of him. And he was faithful and obedient, and to my mind, he's a saint. And if the world survives, he will be a canonized saint one day, Dan. And he stayed a Jesuit and a priest till his death.
We don't know what his thoughts about global warming were.
Right, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The disapproval and hard feelings of the upper echelons of the Catholic Church, or the Catholic Church in general, the conservative elements, which is the most of it now. I went back to Catonsville in August of this year to do research and stay with relatives, and I actually went up to the Knights of Columbus building with my uncle, and I wanted to see the room that the Selective Service office, which is a very, very tiny room, but I just wanted to see it for myself. And when I knocked on the door and introduced myself and was very transparent as to why I was there, I said, I just want to walk up the stairs for 30 seconds, glance at the room, and then I'll be gone. And the woman who I was talking with was incredibly resistant and just refusing to allow that. And I finally said, do you guys still have hard feelings? It's half a century later. I would think you'd be over by now. At which point she got very frustrated, went back to a knight who happened to be back there, who actually came out and actually very graciously took me upstairs. But there's still a lot of feelings there about the action itself. And when they unveiled the state sign, the historical sign, to mark the action and commemorate it, the Knights of Columbus wouldn't allow it anywhere remotely near their property. And it's literally across the street in front of the Catonsville Library.
Now, they burned the draft cards with napalm that they had manufactured themselves. Where did they get the recipe?
From the Special Forces Handbook at Fort Bragg. And
so the military supplied them with it.
Yeah, they followed it mostly. It's basically, according to what's in the play, it's basically, I think, 2 parts gasoline and 1 part ivory soap flakes. And what they didn't do was cook it into a jelly, which is part of the recipe. They left it in liquid form so they could pour it over the files easily.
They took the cards to the parking lot, burned them with this napalm, and I'm assuming that they used the napalm because it was a symbolic gesture, reminding people that napalm was being used in Vietnam. Yes. It was made out of gasoline and ivory soap?
Ivory soap flakes, which is they don't make anymore, I'm sure, but back in the day.
And then after they burned the files, they held hands and recited the Lord's Prayer, made statements to the press. Did they wait for the police to come?
Yes, they all waited. That was the whole intention, was to wait peacefully and be taken off. I mean, John, you can chime in here, but they had like from a theater perspective, I'm very impressed with how they kind of envisioned the whole thing as a big production in a way. And in some ways, their final dress is their first performance, and it all went very much according to plan. And they were, in some ways, extremely lucky because anything could have gone wrong at any minute.
We'll get back to you in a moment. We have to take care of some other business here. This is Leonard Lopate at Large. So you can see actual footage of the action at Catonsville on YouTube. Was that from TV coverage?
Yes, and much of it was buried for a couple of decades,
Had
right,
they
John?
invited the TV people?
They did. I mean, again, an incredible planning on all of them. And I think the planning was mostly, John, wasn't it George Mishi and Philip Barrican did most of the actual, planning? Yeah,
and
the logistics.
That was the CBS Evening News.
So why did they buried it? Because did they think it was just too controversial?
Yes,
Way beyond too controversial. And Walter Cronkite himself would have been involved in stopping that footage. So the crew was actually from New York. Dan knew a lot of the major media. That's why he was in the New York Times and Time and Newsweek. Secretly, people like that were taking him aside, calling him in, saying, what should we do about Vietnam? That was before Catonsville. So he was really respected by mainstream media.
And the bits of film that they did show, they would bury the audio. I think burying the audio was more important to them than burying the visual.
So, in the end, one of the characters in the play points out that by saving these young men, burning their draft cards, they're actually condemning others to death because young men from somewhere else would be drafted in their place.
The judge says that, yes.
Did they intend it simply as a symbolic act, or were they hoping to inspire others to go to their draft boards and do the same thing?
I think all of the above. I think they would take whatever they could get, but the symbolism of it was definitely foremost.
And they were put on.
Symbolism
Go ahead.
was everything,
Mm-hmm.
but Phil then started really organizing actions elsewhere. He told me he spent a year on the road in a Volkswagen. He'd drive to Boston and organize a group there and drive. I mean, it's amazing they didn't just lock him up for life. But if I could say a word about the symbol thing, that was critical for Dan, more even than Phil. Now, so think about it. Dan is this creative poet and a very world-class spiritual leader. He's saying Jesus marches into the temple and nonviolently turns over the tables and says, that's the end of imperial injustice, working with religion, and they kill him. Gandhi marches to the sea and picks up salt and inspires 300 million people to non-cooperate with the British Empire, and that's the end of the British rule. But it was the symbol. And Dorothy Day, if you may remember, in 1959, refused to go underground in the air raid drills. She sat in Washington Square Park and was arrested and jailed. And they stopped the air raid drills because of that. But Dan and Phil felt Martin King, he never really had a symbol per se. He marched in Birmingham and was arrested and so forth. So they thought they encouraged the draft card burnings, but they were looking for the symbol. And what happened, there's a really good book called The Catonsville Nine that came out for a few years ago, which really, the writer, young scholar, interviewed all the living people and found tons of stuff. A lawyer suggested this about a week before to Phil. And what is so shocking to me, if I could just share it a little more, is the statement itself. And I think it's in the play, right, Jack, that
yes.
Dan says.
Mm-hmm.
Phil writes a classic leftist anti-war statement, which is so boring. This much money's going into war. We're killing these many kids. And Dan read it like 4 days before Catonsville and goes, that's not going to inspire anybody. Can I issue my own poetic statement? Okay, they reluctantly said. And Dan writes the statement, which to me, if you looked at the history of resistance in the U.S., from the Boston Tea Party the abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. It's one of the great statements and actions in U.S. Resistance history. And it begins with this incredible sentence that Dan wrote: "Our apologies, good friends, for the burning of paper instead of children. We could not, so help us God, to others." In other words, hey, we'd like to burn children in Vietnam with napalm like the rest of you, but we just can't. All we can do is burn paper. I'm so sorry. And everybody freaked out at them for the burning of paper, but they're not upset about the burning of Vietnamese children with napalm. And that symbol freaked out millions of people. Many took to the streets, and that's why the other draft board raid action started to happen. And in large part, it was that poetic sentence.
I think, I'm speaking
really
of napalm,
brilliant.
one of the things in the play that I was astounded by, because, there's, you learn about the Vietnam War, or you don't, I mean, depending on what era you're in. My generation, we didn't. It was hadn't been over that long, so we didn't really learn about it. It was a drive-by one day, I believe, in high school. But one thing I never understood
It meant for a lot of us, getting on buses and going to Washington fairly regularly.
to understand it.
No, to march against the war.
Right. And by the time in the early 80s when I was in high school, it didn't, they didn't know what to do with it. But I never, I'd heard the word napalm, and I'd heard, I knew it was something bad, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And in the play, it's very spelled out in the testimony of Mary Moylan. And what I didn't know until delving into the play is that it is, it's a jelly, and so when it gets on a human being, there's no way to put it out. It just adheres, and it keeps burning no matter kind of what you do. And so what Mary Moylan says, in effect, a person is burned alive. And that was a really eye-opening, emotional moment for me when I realized that, and I think for the audiences every night.
The Catonsville Nine were put on trial in October 1968. What were the charges? Mainly the destruction of government property?
Pretty much. I mean, there were three separate charges. It was, I think, entering illegally. It's in the beginning of the play, and it's purposely done in a very bureaucratic terminology.
And they all pled not guilty, but since they didn't deny what they'd done, what was their defense? That the actions were justified to stop an immoral war?
Yes.
So that made them not guilty?
George Mishi says, and Thomas Lewis say, and they all say versions of this, but George Mishi says we go by a higher law. And in times like this, when the laws of man no longer serve the morality of the people, then it is our duty to go to a higher law.
Why do I have a feeling the judge wasn't moved by that?
Well, I he didn't accept it, but his name was Roselle Thompson. He's an interesting man and he's a key figure because he was the one who allowed all of them to fully talk and to tell their story. And in Sean Francis Peters' wonderful book that John had just mentioned called The Catonsville Nine, which was an incredibly valuable resource for all of us, he talks about the judge was fascinated by these nine and what brought them to what they did. And so he allowed them to go on, which is why we have this play in many ways.
But they were all found guilty. How long were
Yes.
their sentences?
They ranged from 2 years to 3 years, and then what they ended up serving kind of had a range as well.
And John, you mentioned that they went underground after they were sentenced. Were they all eventually caught? Did they all serve time?
Only 4 of them went underground. Mary Moylan, the Berrigan brothers, and George Mishi. And Mary Moylan actually is interesting because she evaded and stayed at the FBI and stayed underground for 10 years, and she turned herself in. So she was the most successful evader of all of them.
She just got tired of running, I suspect.
Yeah, and it sadly broke her, and I think contributed to her early death.
The trial took place not long after the demonstrations at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago that year. Because the Berrigans were priests and not long-haired hippies, did they hope that their actions would be taken more seriously than other anti-war activists?
I think so. I think one of the things that we kind of learned about and talked about in rehearsal was that they so smartly and bravely and generously and many other things realized that until white middle-class people step into the fray, nothing is going to change. I mean, it's one thing for the people in the minority to be, shouting out against injustice, but it's really up to the people who are privileged to join, and that's when things can actually change, because then it becomes a very different story, and I think they were well aware of that.
When did Daniel Berrigan write this play? Was he still in prison?
No. I mean, John,
No,
you
so he
might know
wrote
this
it-
more than I do.
Yeah. So he got after he was the chaplain of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, around this time, and he's out on bond. They've been found guilty. They're waiting to be sentenced. They're going to be sentenced, and then they have to turn themselves into jail. Ended up being around April 1970, into prison. I mean. And that's when four of them said, we're not turning ourselves in. But anyway, what I remember, later, they started the Plowshares movement, where they walked into the nuclear weapons plant and hammered on it, quoting Isaiah, they shall beat swords into plowshares, and there's been over 100 plowshares actions. And I did one with Phil and spent 9 months in the cell with Phil in 1994 in jail. And I asked Phil about that year and went about the play. And Phil told me he was so mad at Dan. It was all of 1969. Phil is driving around the country organizing other actions. Mm-hmm. And Dan's writing this letter from Cornell where he has the summer off. And Phil says, Dan writes, I'm writing a play. And Phil was so mad at his brother. I'm out there leading the resistance, and you're writing a play. And then I remember Dan sent Phil the first copy, and Phil told me in jail, he put his head down, and he was telling me the story. This was in 1994. I later told Dan this, and he laughed. Phil just couldn't believe the play because it was immediately put on in New York and L.A. and then around the world. And it had a far even bigger and lasting effect.
Yeah.
All the organizing he did.
It had an incredible cast. It ran on Broadway in 1971. Yeah. The cast included Sam Waterston, Michael Moriarty, and James Woods. And in his review in the New York Times, Clive Barnes wrote, the entire play retains the freshness of history, only just dry. History, in other words, it was still alive, this story. Mm-hmm. But is this the first revival since then?
Well, in New York, it was off Broadway in New York at Good Shepherd Church. Then it moved to Broadway, and that was unusual at that time, not so much now, but for a really kind of down and dirty off Broadway endeavor to transfer to Broadway. And then I believe, from the little research I did, I believe there was an off Broadway revival, I think in 1981.
This is 50 years later, and many people in your audience won't even have been born when these things happen. So how do you stage it as a historical document, but one that you hope people will see as relevant today?
No, it's not really a historical document. I think the historical document-ness is just within the play itself, just within the words. No, we have a wonderful cast of 3 actors: Mia Cottagebach, David Huynh, and Eunice Wong. And
they're all Asians.
They're all Asian American, yes.
So they're playing Asians playing non-Asian roles.
Yes.
Is that in a way to represent the Vietnamese, even though all the characters were actually American?
Yeah, well, they were white Americans. They this depends on the play, but often I will look at a play and feel who needs to tell this story. I mean, who needs to be on stage and tell this story, and I try to really comb through the text and see if anything brings itself to light. And I was so fortunate because not in the Broadway version, because there are basically 2 existing versions of the script. There's the original version that Dan Berrigan published in a book form in 1970, and then there was the 1971 Broadway version, which had a slightly different arranged text and some edits and rewrites and so forth. So there's basically 2 versions. Anyway, in the original version that Dan published, which is very literary, he includes, and apparently this is all factual, he includes a poem that the defense read at the end of his summation that Dan had written based on his time in Hanoi, and the play starts with "Imagine 3 of them," and it's a poem that Dan is writing based on his experience watching in a bomb shelter in Hanoi during the bombing with Howard Zinn, and he notices these 3 Vietnamese children in this bomb shelter with him, and he studies them and writes this beautiful poem about them, and it's quoted within the play. And I thought to myself when I saw that, that's who needs to tell this story, 3 Asian American actors.
You've put the stage in the center of the space, and the set is an amalgam of office furniture covered with photographs and clippings. The audience is seated on benches on all 4 sides. Is that to evoke the feeling of being in a church or courtroom?
Probably. I mean, when I went to Catonsville and Baltimore, I actually was able to locate the courtroom in which the trial took place, and the clerk very generously let my uncle and me sit there. And so when I was in the actual courtroom, it did feel like a church. I don't think anything has changed in that courtroom. They're basically pews with mahogany everywhere and burgundy cushions and so forth. And so we wanted to invoke that sort of thing, and I wanted people to kind of sit together as opposed to sitting in separate chairs. It's a directorial thing, and so they sit in pews.
There's a number of talkbacks scheduled. One involving Philip's daughter, Frida Berrigan, who'll be there February 9th, and John, won't you and Chris Hedges be there on the 10th? Isn't Chris's wife one of the actors?
Yes, Chris Hedges is married to Eunice Wong, one of our actors.
Now, the play officially opens on Wednesday, but it's been in previews for a few weeks. What kind of response have you been getting?
I mean, very encouraging. Many people, they either don't know this story or their knowledge of the Vietnam War in general is rather hazy. And, we're living in obviously a very stressful time with what the country's going through right now and how divided we all are. So I think it's, ultimately the play and the action was one of hope. The defense has this beautiful line where he's talking about the 9 of them and what they were trying to do. And he says it was a cry, it was an outcry of anguish and despair and hope. And I thought it was interesting that the hope is the last impression that the action gave. And so I'd like to think that people are very disturbed by it, but also hopeful that these 9 are inspiring them.
And how long is the run scheduled to be?
We close February 23rd.
The trial of the Catonsville 9 is at the Abrams Art Center at 466 Grand Street. That's part of the Henry Seat Settlement?
Yes, yeah, a wonderful, wonderful place and organization.
And do you have any plans to take it elsewhere after?
Well, I mean, it's very portable. I would love that. We'd all love to take it as many places as we can, especially during the next 2 years when the election will be gearing up. I think it would speak to a lot of people. So, we'll see.
John, do you have any sense of how Dan and Phil would have responded to this production?
Well, I know Dan would love it, and I regret that we didn't get to meet Jack because, Dan lived for 45 years on the Upper West Side, around the corner from where Jack lives.
Yeah.
But he would just love this and be thrilled, and I know that because over the decades we'd get letters. The play was, I remember, performed by the IRA in Belfast. It was performed all over Germany by the anti-nuclear movement in the 80s, which was massive movement involving millions of people, and Dan and Phil went over for several of the shows. It was performed in Greece in the 90s and had a huge impact nationally there.
So people saw it as relevant to their own personal movements.
Right.
Exactly, to their struggles. And I hope people will come and see Jack's show because we need to be inspired, as Dan would say, to keep being part of the grassroots movement of nonviolence now, not just to end the war in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen, which has to happen, but to end war itself and abolish nuclear weapons and racism and poverty and really begin to apply nonviolence. We need to go way beyond the Trump administration to create a new, more peaceful, nonviolent world. And that's why Dan would be so happy about this. I know that for a fact. So thank you, Jack, and thank you, Leonard, for promoting it.
The trial.
And I hope people will get the book and read it, or read Dan's autobiography, or the book I did, Daniel Berrigan, Essential Writings.
The trial of the Catonsville Nine is being revived by the Transport Group in collaboration with the National Asian American Theater Company on stage at the Abrams Art Center on Grand Street until February 23rd. My great thanks to its director, Jack Cummings III, and to Daniel Berrigan's close friend, editor, and literary executor, John Deere, for being on our show today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
And that brings us to the end of today's show. My great thanks to John Deere and Jack Cummings III, to Barbara Kahn, who produced this segment, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my executive producer, Jesse Lent. Leonard Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.